What would you do if the very first morning after moving into your dream property, strangers stormed down your dock screaming that your lake was theirs? Before Logan could even breathe, Karen in white and her bullies were already on the bridge, demanding he leave. They didn't know the man they were facing had fought battles harder than this. They thought they owned him. But the moment he gripped that ranch stick, the real war for the lake began. You know this isn't just Logan's fight. It's every homeowner's worst nightmare. If you've ever had to stand your ground against people who thought they owned you, stick with me. Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. The morning was supposed to be quiet, a fresh start for Logan after years of fighting to build a life worth living. Instead, voices cut through the air like a blade, growing louder with every step on the wooden bridge. Karen appeared first, dressed in blinding white like she was marching into court, her heels slamming the boards. Marcus and Trent close behind her with smug grins plastered on their faces. They didn't pause, didn't ask, didn't even blink before accusing him of trespassing on what they called community property. Logan's jaw locked. He had carried crates all morning, sweat soaking his shirt, but now the only thing he carried was rage. His grip tightened on the ranch stick in his hand as Karen stepped closer, fingers stabbing the air toward his chest. She shouted that the lake wasn't his, that the HOA controlled every drop of water he could see, and if he didn't leave immediately, they would make sure he regretted ever setting foot here. Marcus laughed as if it was all a game, taunting him, telling him he had 1 hour before the sheriff arrived. Trent chimed in with a lazy grin, daring Logan to fight back so they could handle him. Every word they threw at him was a spark, and Logan felt the fire rise in his chest. He didn't yell, he didn't flinch. He planted the ranch stick in the dirt so hard it sent a sharp crack through the air. That was his line. They crossed it, everything changed. Karen smirked, tilting her head like she'd just been given permission to strike. She told him this lake had always belonged to the HOA, and so did the docks. Her voice was smooth, venomous, the kind of tone meant to make a man feel small. Logan didn't move. The war he thought he had left behind was suddenly standing on his bridge, wearing pearl earrings and a smile that dared him to stop her. His chest tightened as memories flashed, his brother's folded flag, the day he promised himself he would never let anyone take something from him again. He bought this land with everything he had left, every scar earned and dollars saved. And now, on the first morning of peace, chaos had come knocking. Marcus took one step forward, just one, like he was testing the line. Logan's eyes followed every inch of his movement, ranch sticks still buried in the earth, ready to be pulled free. The bullies chuckled as if they had already won, but there was something in Logan's silence that made Trent shift uncomfortably. For a brief second, they realized this wasn't a man they could push. Karen laughed again, that sharp, cutting laugh that carried across the water. She said he'd be gone by nightfall, that she had the board's full support, and there was nothing he could do. Logan finally spoke, voice low and cold, telling her she had no idea who she was dealing with. The sound of sirens cut through the tension like a blade. They weren't far, growing louder every second, and suddenly Karen's smirk widened. She turned to Marcus and whispered that this would all be over soon. Logan's hand slid to the ranch stick, pulling it free from the ground with slow, deliberate force. His voice dropped to a near growl, promising them that what was about to happen next would change everything they thought they knew. And then the sirens got closer. The patrol cars rolled in, and the island held its breath. Sheriff Cole stepped out first, not rushing, not grandstanding, just taking in the standoff with eyes that had seen too many bad mornings. Karen lifted her chin like a queen greeting her guards and announced that a trespasser was threatening residents with a weapon. Marcus added that the man refused to leave community property. Trent smirked, certain the badges would finish what the HOA started. Logan didn't move. He held the ranch stick low, steady, like a promise he wouldn't break. Sheriff Cole didn't bite. He studied Logan, studied the grip, the pulse at the neck, the stillness that belongs to people who've already decided what they can live with. He asked who was owner on record. Karen spoke first, fast and practiced. HOA property, Lakeside Common Access. She thanked the sheriff for arriving quickly and said they'd handle removal after a formal warning. The sheriff turned to Logan and asked if he had anything to show. Logan nodded once and handed him a thick envelope secured with a rubber band. The envelope landed in the sheriff's hand with the weight of something final. He slid out the deed, the survey, the closing statement with time stamps and signatures that didn't tremble. Deputy Ward took photos of each page. Deputy Lena read the parcel line out loud in a level tone that made Karen's smile twitch. Cole asked Karen if she had papers to refute it. She said the HOA bylaws superseded individual claims around shared assets, and that the lake and docks were governed by covenant. She said it like a spell that had always worked before. Cole read quietly. He asked Logan how long he had been in possession. Logan answered evenly that this morning was his first sunrise as owner, and it was met by demands and threats. Marcus sneered and stepped closer as if proximity could erase ink. Cole lifted a hand without looking at him and told everyone to hold position. Marcus stopped, annoyed to find that the law obeys signals only when the law gives them. Karen changed tactics. Her voice softened. She said Logan had raised a stick and advanced toward her. Trent nodded eagerly. Deputy Lena glanced at the ground where the stick had been planted and at the scuffed line like a boundary scratched into a heart. Logan spoke without heat. The stick is not a weapon. It is a warning. No further. That was all. The words were simple. The effect was not. Even Marcus shifted on his heels, suddenly aware that certain men make good on the short sentences. Cole returned to the papers. The deed did not argue. It stated. The survey did not waver. It measured. He exhaled and told Karen the island was privately owned and the individual standing on it had every right to be there. He told the HOA they were currently on a bridge to private property and that further entry without permission invited consequences. Marcus laughed to chase away the chill and reached for the document. Cole stepped between him and the folder, a quiet wall. "Step back, sir," he said, and Marcus did, more surprised than he wanted to show. Karen's jaw tightened. She pivoted to the covenant language and said even if the land transferred, the water did not, and even if the water didn't, the docks belonged to the association. She said the association controlled access and maintenance and had authority to regulate. Her words piled into a house she thought would never fall. Logan reached into the envelope again and produced a second set of papers, thinner but sharper, like a blade wrapped in letterhead. The clause was old, older than some of the owners in the subdivision, recorded with a dry stamp and a legal description that read like coordinates to a secret. Cole read it twice. Ward read it once and blinked. Lena's lips parted. The clause transferred riparian control with the original parcel and assigned operational authority over all docking structures tethered to the island's shoreline and easements. In plain language, the right to manage, grant, deny, and regulate dock use sat with the island's title holder, not the HOA board. Karen's color faded a shade. Trent muttered that it had to be a trick. Marcus swore under his breath and tried to laugh it off, but the laugh fought to get out and lost. Cole asked Karen when the board last reviewed the historic filings. She said the board had long-standing practices. Practices, he replied, are not filings. Logan didn't gloat. He let the paper speak because paper, when clean and true, is louder than any shout. He added only one sentence. If the board claims the lake to deny me, then it also admits the docks are mine to deny them. The sentence did what bullets do in cheaper stories. It changed the air pressure. The bullies suddenly understood their boats, their rentals, their summer leverage could vanish with one signature they did not own. Karen tried one more angle. She placed a hand on her chest and told the deputies she felt threatened, that Logan's posture was aggressive, that residents were in fear. Deputy Lena looked at Logan's boots and hands, then at Karen's perfect composure. Fear rarely keeps Pearl straight. Cole said both sides would take a breath. He stated that as of now, Logan's document stood. He advised the HOA to schedule a formal review in court if they disagreed and warned them that continued entry would be logged as trespass. He turned to Logan and said the law protects, but escalation helps no one. Logan nodded and lowered the stick by an inch, not surrendering, just acknowledging the line had been seen. Marcus couldn't hold his tongue. He leaned past Cole and hissed that this wasn't over, that the board would crush a loophole with a vote before sunset. Logan answered that loopholes don't survive light. Trent muttered to Karen that they should regroup. Karen shot him a look sharp enough to cut thread and told Cole she expected full enforcement of HOA rules by evening. Cole held up the clause again, tapping the notarized page as if to say enforcement starts with ink, not volume. Neighbors had gathered at the edges. whispers stacking into rumors. Some recognized Logan's name from whispers of service, the quiet profile of the man who doesn't announce his strength but carries it anyway. A woman near the back asked if this meant her family's seasonal dock pass depended on a man the HOA had never met. Cole didn't answer. He wasn't here to arbitrate commerce. Logan heard it, though, and he didn't smirk. He said evenly that he would never punish families for the board's bullying. The sentence landed like a hand offered, not a fist. A father in the crowd nodded, filing that away where hope lives. Karen tried a final performance, voice trembling just enough to be noticed. She told the deputies she feared retaliation, that Logan had threatened to swing the stick. Ward checked his notes. He had recorded the moment the stick was planted and the moment it was lifted. There was no lunge, no swing. Cole stated the record. The claim dissolved midair. Karen's eyes flared, not with fear, but with something older and hungrier. Control slipping through fingers that never expected to be empty. Cole began writing a short incident report to close the call when a crackle on the radio clipped his sentence in half. Ward pressed a hand to his earpiece, listening hard. Lena glanced toward the road and squinted. Sirens again, different pattern, the kind that rides with administrative cars and black sedans. Karen's mouth curved into something colder than a smile. "Back up," she said softly, "but not for you." Logan's knuckles flexed around the stick, not in panic, in readiness. Cole looked from the approaching lights to the claws in his hand and understood that whatever was coming next wouldn't be settled by routine. The second wave was almost here, and no one knew whose side it was bringing. The second wave arrived like a verdict no one agreed to. The first sedan stopped and the door opened on Daniel Hart, county legal officer, sleeves rolled, eyes scanning faces until they landed on Logan. Recognition clicked. Hart greeted him by name with the steady tone of a man who signs outcomes. Karen bristled at the familiarity, tried to bulldoze over it, announced that Logan's documents were fraudulent and that the county would back the association. Hart didn't even look at her. He asked for the file. Cole handed over the folder. Hart read in tight, efficient beats, lips moving just enough to tell anyone watching that he wasn't skimming. He asked Logan a single question about the closing date. The answer matched the stamp. He asked about the recorded addendum. Ward produced the page. Hart nodded once, the kind of nod that closes doors behind it. Karen's smile attempted to reload and jammed mid-face. If the law recognizes a thing, what happens to the people who tried to shout it out of existence? Marcus couldn't stand the silence forming around him like a shrink-wrapped truth. He stomped forward and kicked one of Logan's crates, as if the wood could take the blame his pride refused. The lid split, and something folded and sacred slid out into the light. Logan dropped to one knee, so fast the bridge seemed to hitch. His hands lifted the flag like it could break. The colors were worn at the creases where grief lives. Marcus saw it too late. The joke on his mouth died. Logan stood with the flag at his chest, and the world rearranged itself around that simple posture. He said he buried a brother who never backed up from a line like this, and he wasn't about to start. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Even Karen flinched, just a flicker, like humanity tried to raise a hand before pride shoved it back down. How many neighbors felt their own losses rise? How many sons and fathers measured themselves quietly against that kind of promise? Hart cleared his throat and addressed the group with the clinical mercy of a surgeon. The deed is valid. The survey stands. The riparian control clause is binding and assigns operational authority over the docks to the island's owner. Effective immediately, any board action contradicting that clause would be unenforceable and likely unlawful. The words fell like keys on a table after midnight. Who owns the room now? Karen rebooted. She said the clause was outdated, that precedent was on their side, that practice had always favored the association. Hart replied that practice is not law and that outdated becomes current the moment it is properly recorded, which it was. Marcus muttered that this would cost the neighborhood everything. Logan answered that neighborhoods aren't built on threats. They're built on fairness, and he was done paying for someone else's power habit. Trent, who had ridden Karen's shadow for months, took half a step back as if a tide changed under his shoes. Cole raised his hands to reset the temperature. He warned that any further damage to property would trigger charges. He advised the association to schedule counsel, not confrontations. Karen ignored him and dialed. Her voice sharpened to a blade as she told someone to bring the board now. She promised a decisive hour, a removal, A correction. She promised the end of a man who refused to kneel. Promises are easy fuel. The hard part is what happens when the fire meets water. Neighbors watched with the alert stillness of people who know today decides tomorrow's bills. A teen near the back whispered to her father and asked if they were the bad guys. The father didn't answer because he was counting the times he had kept quiet when he should have stood up. Retention is not only a metric, it's the human grip on a moment that matters. Who lets go first when the narrative is heavy and personal? Marcus tried to recover ground with swagger. He told Logan that men like him burn out fast when paperwork gets complicated. Logan replied that complicated is a word people use when they're allergic to consequences. Hart didn't smile, but his eyes almost did. Ward finished noting the crate damage and asked Marcus to sign. Marcus refused until Cole reminded him that refusal would be appended to the report. He scrawled something that looked like anger learning how to write. Karen shifted to performance, tears perched but refusing to fall. She said the community was unsafe with a man who brought weapons to a bridge. Lena pointed out that a raised voice is louder than a stick planted in the ground. Karen tried to move past Hart, but he blocked with a single sentence. Until adjudicated, this island is off limits without permission. Each step one takes across that line is a choice the court will read loudly. How many choices had they already made on camera, in public, under their own names? Logan refolded the flag, edges perfect, hands steady. He slid it back into the crate as if returning a heart to a rib cage. He whispered a promise to keep what mattered safe, and even those who disliked him felt that oath as something too old to argue with. He didn't weaponize his grief. He armored his resolve. Marcus looked away. Trent's jaw worked like he wanted to apologize to someone, maybe himself. Hart closed the folder and told Cole to mark the incident resolved pending civil review. Karen laughed, a brittle sound, and said the word resolved tasted like surrender. She said the board didn't surrender. She said power belongs to those who show up with numbers. Cole reminded her that numbers don't outrun law. She told him he'd learn how fast numbers move when money's on the line. Cole didn't blink. He'd already learned. From the road, engines swelled again. Not a single car this time. Several, black, polished, windows shaded against judgment. Doors opened with the confidence of checks already cashed. Men and women in dark suits stepped out. The HOA board made flesh and strategy. They formed ranks at the bridge entrance, ties neat, tempers neater. Karen's spine straightened as if they plugged a cord into the back of her neck. She lifted a hand and the suits moved onto the planks, a smooth tide rolling toward a rock that did not move. Logan stood alone at the line he had drawn with Wood and Will. Hart slid the folder under his arm and watched the formation approach. Cole shifted his stance and told Ward and Lena to set perimeter, not because he expected violence, but because pride at scale behaves like weather. Marcus bounced on his heels, energy back, convinced the numbers would make courage irrelevant. Trent whispered to Karen that this might go bad. She answered that power never goes bad, it goes louder. The first board member to speak had a voice that sold houses and rules. He announced that the association would not recognize any antiquated clause meant to strip communal rights. He said the board had voted to assert full control of the docks and lake. Hart raised an eyebrow and asked when the vote occurred, who was present, and whether proper notice was given. The man hesitated a heartbeat too long. That heartbeat told on him like a child with crumbs on his shirt. Logan scanned their faces and found one pair of eyes not matching the others. A man near the back, pocket square crooked, gaze unsettled. He didn't stand like the rest. He looked at Logan like someone carrying a weight that wasn't his. For a second the noise dimmed, and only that glance existed, a crack in the wall where light considered entering. Who breaks first when loyalty and truth collide in a chest that can't hold both? Karen stepped forward and declared that this would end now. She said the docks would be chained by sundown, that all access would be revoked, that anyone who wanted a future on this lake would remember who signs the permits. Logan answered that the only signature that mattered on those docks belonged to the deed he carried. The board muttered. Hart said the court would adore this transcript. Cole wrote the time with a pen that never shakes. The insider with the crooked square swallowed hard. He took a breath like a diver staring at dark water. He edged closer to Logan, voice low enough to be a sin, and said that the board's books weren't clean, that funds tagged for maintenance had gone missing, that Karen's accounts told a story no community wanted to read. Logan didn't react big. He simply asked if there was proof. The man tapped his jacket once, as if to say the pages were already warm against his ribs. The board began to fan across the bridge, building a wall with expensive fabric and borrowed certainty. Neighbors pressed in along the shore. Marcus cracked his knuckles, grinning at the thought of a scene that might bury the morning's humiliation. Karen lifted her chin and pointed a white-painted nail at Logan, ready to pronounce a sentence she had no right to say. The lake held the sound for a breathless beat, like even the water wanted to know who owned what came next. Engines hummed again beyond the suits, a thicker sound, heavier, like money getting out of a chair. More SUVs, more eyes, more stakes. Hart's jaw set. Cole's hand hovered an inch higher over his belt. Logan rolled his shoulders once, grounding himself in muscles that remembered how to stand when outnumbered. He spoke so softly only the closest heard it. This just turned into war. And then the next wave reached the bridge. The next wave of power wore suits and practiced smiles. Board members filed onto the bridge with calm that felt rehearsed, shoulders square, eyes trained on Logan as if he were a problem to be budgeted, not a man drawing a line he intended to keep. At the front, Chairwoman Lila Stone delivered a speech in flawless committee cadence about unity, rules, and preserving community standards. Karen glowed like a monarch returning to her throne. Marcus swelled behind her. Trent stayed close enough to matter, but far enough to dodge consequences. Logan didn't answer the speech. He answered the leverage buried inside it. He said the board could talk about standards all day, but contracts don't salute speeches. He said authority without law is costume jewelry, shiny until the first real light hits it. Lila blinked at the insult wrapped in a proverb, recovered, and announced the board's intention to proceed with their approved development plan. The phrase approved development moved like a chill through the neighbors. Sheriff Cole asked for details. Karen stepped in with a smile that could slice fruit and said the board had the right to lower the water level seasonally for safety and improvements. Daniel Hart cut through the charm with 2 words. How much? The pause after those words carried teeth. Lila folded her hands and said enough to complete a community upgrade. Nothing drastic. The man with the crooked pocket square, Evan Reed, stared at the planks like they might confess. Hart pressed again. Numbers, dates, contractors. Lila's eyes slid to Karen for a breath, so short it could be denied. Karen answered that engineering would file the schedule. Logan felt the shape of the play long before it reached the end zone. Lower the lake far enough, the island stops being an island. Docks become stranded, property values snap like dry twigs. Turn a home into a cul-de-sac and call it progress. Logan called it what it was. He said if they drained this water level for a vanity project, he would exercise the clause and shut every dock they pretended to control. He said the rentals would halt, the launches would stop, and the donors who brag about summer slips would suddenly get very quiet when their boats touched mud. A murmur rolled through the crowd like distant thunder. Marcus jabbed a finger toward Logan's chest and told him he couldn't threaten livelihoods. Logan replied that the board did that already and handed the sheriff the plan disguised as an upgrade. Karen snapped that he had no right to dictate anything beyond his fence line. Hart tapped the clause with a fingernail and corrected her. Riparian control travels with title. Access lives or dies where that clause says it does. Evan's throat worked like truth, trying to climb up. He drifted closer to Logan, guilt making his posture tilt. Quietly, he admitted that Karen had pitched a redevelopment that looked beautiful on a brochure and lethal in a ledger. Lower the water 4 feet. Add parking. Expand the promenade. Protect the community by starving a single owner until he sells. Trent whispered a curse he forgot to swallow. Cole warned everyone to keep voices down. The warning bought 3 seconds of quiet, enough for Lila to regroup. She announced a temporary board order to chain the docks pending review, a stunt dressed as prudence. Hart's brow lifted, unimpressed. Orders without jurisdiction are theater. He asked if council had vetted the motion. Lila said yes. Evan flinched. Logan caught it and pressed him with a name, and Evan gave one. Basalt Partners, a developer waiting like a hawk just beyond the trailing. The board wasn't only draining water, they were priming a sale. Marcus shoved Logan then. A quick mean push meant to provoke. The ranch stick came up halfway, then stopped as Cole and Deputy Lena stepped between bodies and consequences. Ward announced clearly that contact had been made and would be documented. Karen tried to pivot the moment, hands lifted, voice trembling with the practiced tremor of someone who auditions for victim roles. She told the crowd Logan was dangerous, unstable, unfit to anchor a neighborhood. A woman near the back asked how unstable looks when it files perfect deeds and cites clauses memorizable in the time it takes to make breakfast. Karen's jaw tightened around a reply that refused to arrive. Evan tugged at his pocket square like he needed a new identity. He told Logan he had proof of how board funds had been rerouted. Invoices dressed as repairs, payments dressed as refunds, cards used like little private rivers. He said he could hand over the ledger if there were witnesses. Hart said he would be one. Cole said he'd take the second. Logan nodded once, a short nod that carries the weight of a door unlocking. Lila sensed the momentum tilt and reached for the only button left, urgency. She declared an emergency meeting at sundown to vote on revoking Logan's community membership, claiming it endangered harmony. The word harmony sounded like a joke even before neighbors laughed without humor. Hart told her membership isn't a leash-over title. Karen interjected that optics matter and neighbors hate chaos. Logan answered that chaos is what bullies call accountability when it walks in during lunch. Marcus tried one last intimidation, leaning close enough for breath to be a message. Logan didn't step back. He reminded Marcus he had already taken his best shot, and all it did was write his name into the report. Trent pulled Marcus by the sleeve, but the pull came late. Pride had already kicked the door open and invited consequences to sit down. Evan started to move toward Hart with the ledger when Lila cut him off with a look that could set curtains on fire. She called him disloyal, said the board had carried him for years. Evan took the insult like a slap and finally straightened his pocket square as if his spine found itself at last. He said loyalty to neighbors beats loyalty to secrets. The sentence was small, the effect was seismic. Marcus muttered that Evan would regret it. Evan said regret already lived in the mirror every morning. Hart asked Evan to confirm dates in front of witnesses. Evan did, voice steadying with every word that left his mouth. He named a transfer marked as shoreline lighting that paid for 3 weekends in Palm Springs. He named a fictitious contractor that matched a cousin's LLC. He named a deck repair that never happened. Each syllable hit like a hammer on old paint, flaking the gloss until raw wood showed. Neighbors stared at Karen, who smiled too brightly for a woman accused of turning trust into her wallet. Cole announced the next steps: collect the ledger, copy the pages, secure statements. Lila objected that internal matters should stay internal. Cole replied that crimes never are. Karen's temper finally broke the ribbon it had been tied with. She lunged for Evan's arm, a flash of white and fury, and nearly pitched herself off the rail when the bridge flexed back. Marcus grabbed her just in time. For one suspended second, all the power she flaunted dangled on someone else's grip in full view of everyone she had ever tried to impress. The silence that followed wasn't sympathy. It was clarity devouring illusion. Logan didn't taunt her. He said only that lines exist for a reason, and every time she stepped over one, she proved his case for him. Karen's breathing came ragged. She forced her face smooth and whispered that she still had the board and the process and the votes. Lila found her voice again and echoed the promise. Sundown. Emergency session. Outcome guaranteed. It sounded like confidence. It tasted like fear. Hart checked his watch and told Cole he would file an immediate notice preserving evidence. Evan nodded, ready to walk the pages off the bridge and into daylight. Neighbors shifted from spectators to jurors, quiet but awake. Trent avoided everyone's eyes. Marcus tried to remember how to smirk and couldn't find the muscle. Logan lifted the ranch stick just enough to signal the same boundary it had always meant. He said the docks stay open for families and closed for extortion. He said any chains that appear before a judge signs a stamp will be cut and delivered back to the sender like a returned package marked refused. A father near the end of the line exhaled in relief he didn't know he'd been holding. A teen recorded everything with hands that didn't shake anymore. Karen straightened her blazer and told the crowd she would restore order by nightfall. She promised the lake would answer to the board again. She promised that anyone who stood with Logan would feel it in their dues and their weekends. Promises carry weight until someone sets down something heavier. Evan held up the ledger. Hart held the clause. Cole held the report. Logan held the line. Engines idled. Conversations hushed. The bridge felt like a fuse burning towards sundown. Karen leaned close enough for Logan to hear the last card leaving her mouth. "There's a vote tonight," she said, "a secret one, and when it's done, you'll be legally alone." Logan looked past her at Evan, at the neighbors, at the deputies writing time into history. "Alone is a word people use when they haven't met truth yet," he said. And then Karen smiled a small, dangerous smile that didn't reach her eyes and signaled to Lila. The board scattered with purpose, phones out, messages flying like arrows toward a target the crowd couldn't see. Hart told Cole to expect interference. Cole told Ward to start the evidence chain. Logan rested the ranch stick against his shoulder, calm in a way that scares cowards more than rage ever will. Sundown wasn't far. The vote was closer. And somewhere between them, a door none of them had noticed yet was about to swing open on a secret that would rip the neighborhood in half. Evan brought the ledger to life with names, dates, transfers, and the room changed temperature in a heartbeat. Payments labeled shoreline safety that fed personal weekends. Vague consulting that became handbags and hotel suites. Maintenance retainer that never touched a single plank. Hart tracked every entry like a hunter following prints, and neighbors watched their dues turn into someone else's lifestyle with a nausea that feels like betrayal knotted to the ribs. How many quiet warnings had they ignored because a smile in a meeting told them not to worry? Karen tried to talk through it, but each word landed on paper that didn't blink. Marcus barked that this was slander, then froze as Cole marked the outburst beside a page number and a timestamp. Trent stared at the ledger like it might sprout teeth. Evan steadied, page by page, voice smoothing into a rhythm of truth that didn't need theatrics. A mother in the crowd covered her mouth. A contractor shook his head slowly. A teenager whispered that this is what power looks like when it thinks no one will ever flip the lights. Karen pivoted to outrage, then to wounded dignity, then to a fragile tremor designed to pull sympathy across the bridge like a rug. She reached for Evan's hands. He stepped back and let the silence say what he couldn't. Lila tried to reclaim control with a speech about process and privacy, but Hart cut straight through with the dull blade of procedure, evidence preservation, immediate copies, preliminary referral. The words weren't loud, but they carried more gravity than any speech crafted to keep a lid on boiling water. Who was going to hold the lid when steam turned to scald? Marcus lunged at the ledger and clipped Karen's shoulder, pitching her off balance into a stumble that ended at the rail. For a breath, the whole crowd saw the queen of rules teeter with nothing beneath her but consequence. Marcus grabbed her and saved the fall, but not the image. It burned into a dozen phones and 100 memories, power begging gravity for one more chance. How many fines, warnings, and threats had come from that mouth? And how many would mean anything after this? Logan didn't gloat. He addressed the only thing that mattered now: boundaries. He told Karen her steps had crossed lines all morning, and the next one would be legal. He would file for a restraining order and seek an accounting under oath. The sentence wasn't a threat. It was a date carved into stone. Karen straightened, face blanked into porcelain, and whispered that she still had numbers. She had a vote. She had a board that knew how to win even when the facts refused to play along. How far would she push people who were already feeling the floor shift? Evan added a page no one expected. A transfer to Basalt Partners labeled Community Enhancement Escrow, signed by Karen and countersigned by a cousin on a shell account. Lila's confidence cracked visible at the edges. She demanded the document, but Hart declined and passed it to Cole for chain of custody. Trent finally spoke, a thin thread of loyalty snapping in public. He asked Karen if this was why they were draining the water, to strand an island and clear a path for sale. Karen smiled a dangerous little smile and said development raises all boats if people know how to swim. Whose heads was she willing to hold under? Neighbors began to choose sides not with shouting but with distance. People stepped away from Karen and closer to Logan without saying a word. A father thanked Logan under his breath for keeping docks open. An older couple nodded like the world had finally said sorry for something it owed them years ago. Retention isn't just engagement. It's a crowd deciding which face they want to remember when they tell the story later. Who earns the retelling when the lights go off? Cole turned to logistics. The ledger would be scanned now. Statements would be taken. Any attempt to chain docks without a court order would be recorded and answered. Hart backed it with the claws like a keel that won't snap even in rough water. Karen laughed softly, the laugh people use when they have a card hidden under the table. She announced the emergency session would proceed, and proxies had already been collected. She announced a motion to revoke membership and isolate access until further notice. She announced it as if announcing makes a thing legitimate by volume alone. Would a gavel matter when title papers already carried the only signature that counts? Logan met her certainty with a simple counterweight. He held up a notarized letter prepared for exactly this moment, appointing an interim dock operations policy that prioritized family permits, disabled access, and emergency services, all under his authority granted by the clause. He wasn't closing doors. He was locking out extortion and keeping passage clear for people who never asked for a war. The crowd felt the difference and breathed easier because fairness speaks a dialect everyone understands. What does a bully do when kindness steals the room? Evan leaned in with the quiet courage of a man who chose truth knowing it would cost him friends. He offered to accompany Hart to make copies. Lila attempted to block them with a rule quoted from memory. Hart replied with a statute quoted from a deeper place. Cole stepped with them, Ward behind, Lena watching the edges where anger likes to sneak in. Marcus paced like a dog that smells a storm and has nowhere to dig. Trent kept his eyes on the boards, counting, measuring, deciding who he wants to be when the vote is read out loud. Karen pulled herself back into symmetry and made one last scene. She spun to the neighbors and pleaded that this was about safety, about standards, about protecting children from reckless owners who bring sticks to arguments. A kid in the front held up a phone and asked if safety takes money that never touches the thing it names. Karen's reply stuck to her tongue, heavy with everything that didn't add up. How many times can a story fail before even the author stops believing it? Hart returned with scans secured and informed Karen of the obvious. Tampering would not go well for anyone tonight. She answered with ice that she didn't need tampering. She had votes. Lila echoed it like a choir that learned one note and refuses to change songs. Cole noted the meeting time. Logan nodded once, not as a man walking into a trap, but as a man who already mapped the exits and the fuse. He lifted the ranch stick to his shoulder, not as threat, as anchor, and told the crowd the docks would remain open until a judge said otherwise. The father from earlier exhaled another ounce of fear. The teen lowered her phone and just watched like people watch heroes when they finally recognize one. For a heartbeat, it felt like the day might end right there with paper triumphing over posture. Then Karen leaned close enough for only Logan to hear and revealed the last maneuver. A confidential notice had been filed to request a temporary injunction on his clause, fast-tracked by a friendly counsel, timed to hit the docket at the exact minute the vote opened. If both landed, they'd freeze him in place and starve him with bureaucracy. How do you fight a hand that tries to snuff the light and rename it procedure? Logan didn't blink. He told her the lake remembers who kept it honest and that the first lie always leaves footprints. She smiled like footprints vanish in the dark. She gathered her people and swept off the bridge with a promise floating behind her that sounded less like victory and more like weather warning. Sundown bled toward the meeting hour. Engines turned over. Doors closed. Hart checked his file. Evan clutched the ledger. Cole lined out patrol assignments and told Ward to keep cameras rolling. Logan stood at his boundary for one last beat and tightened his grip on the stick that wasn't a weapon, just a line made visible. The island quieted to the sound of breath held before a verdict. Then a message hit Hart's phone, flashing with a docket number that shouldn't have been possible this fast, and Karen's SUV idled by the dock with its lights still on, a folder propped on the passenger seat like it wanted to be found or feared being forgotten. Which move was it? Bait or panic? And which door would Logan have to open first when the night began to vote? The meeting room hummed with nerves dressed up as civility. Neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, eyes flicking between the board table and the stack of papers Hart carried like a quiet hammer. Karen arrived in white like a verdict she wrote herself. Marcus orbiting close, Trent scanning for exits, Lila already shuffling motions as if speed could outrun truth. Sheriff Cole stood at the back with Ward and Lena, present without ceremony, a reminder that the night would remember every step. Karen started fast, voice warm with practiced empathy, a story about safety, order, and a dangerous newcomer who threatened families. Heads nodded out of habit before minds caught up. Then Hart set the ledger and the clause on the table, and the habit cracked. He didn't give speeches. He read dates, transfers, signatures, and the clause that chained authority to title no matter who held a gavel. Lila tried to interrupt. Cole raised a hand, and the room held its breath like a glass about to sing. Logan didn't grandstand. He spoke once, to the people whose weekends were built on small joys. Docks stay open for families, closed for extortion. The line was simple, and it landed where resentment had been waiting for something clean to follow. A contractor in the back muttered that finally someone said the quiet part with a spine. A mother squeezed her kid's shoulder, the kind of gesture that says we are not alone anymore. If you've ever watched a room decide who deserves the mic, you know the second it flips. Karen pivoted to politics. She announced proxies, quorum, emergency authority, and a motion to suspend Logan's community membership pending review. Lila seconded before the echo died. Evan cleared his throat and read from the ledger. The entry marked shoreline safety that became a weekend with receipts that smelled like perfume. The room murmured with the sound of people connecting dots they had pretended were stars. Marcus called it character assassination. Hart called it documentation. Trent stared at the table as if guilt were etched into the grain. Karen tried one more spell, naming the lake as a communal soul under threat by a man with a stick. Ward reported for the record that the stick had not been used as a weapon. Lena added that threats usually travel with volume, not restraint. Karen's smile thinned until it showed its bones. She pushed the vote anyway. Hands rose for harmony, for standards, for the comfort of the old story. Then Evan stepped between the story and the vote and laid down the page with Basalt Partners. The word escrow became a siren. Lila hesitated, long enough for courage to find a few more spines in the audience. A neighbor stood and asked where her dues went. Another asked why repairs looked new only on paper. A third asked how draining a lake helps safety when children learn to swim in water, not promises. Karen snapped that leadership requires hard choices. Logan answered that theft requires soft language. The room chose which sentence to remember. Cole called for order, but order had already picked a side. Board members looked at one another and saw the edge of a cliff where they expected a runway. Trent leaned toward Karen and asked if they could walk this back. She whispered that retreat breeds wolves. He sat back with the face of a man realizing he has been running from the wrong pack. Hart recommended a motion to remove Karen pending investigation and to appoint a temporary chair until the county concluded review. Silence folded over the table like a heavy curtain. Lila tried to gavel through it. The gavel didn't care. A board member at the end, who had worn neutrality like armor all year, lifted her hand and said enough. She moved to remove. Evan seconded with a voice that didn't shake anymore. Hands rose not for harmony this time, but for oxygen. Names recorded, counts tallied, and the story that had run this neighborhood for years hit a wall that would not move. Karen laughed, the small, brittle kind that cuts the throat on the way out. She called them ingrates, said they would crawl back when donations dried up and docks rusted in place. Logan met the glare without spite. He said accountability is the cheapest renovation a community can buy. The new acting chair looked at Hart like a person waking from a dream and asked for county guidance. Hart advised immediate audit, preservation of evidence, and public notice by morning. Cole added that any tampering tonight would become tomorrow's charges. Marcus surged to his feet to escort Karen out like a knight rescuing a queen whose crown had sprouted teeth. Neighbors parted, but not for reverence. They moved the way people move around a storm that has lost its name. Trent lingered behind, stuck between habit and the sudden weight of his own reflection. Evan collected the ledger as if it were a small animal that needed protection. The vote to suspend Logan's membership died on the floor with no second. The motion to formalize his authority over docks pending court confirmation passed with practical hands that wanted the boats to launch on Saturday. Relief moved through the room like a tide changing direction. Not triumph, not gloating, just the release that comes when something true finally speaks louder than a rumor. Karen paused at the doorway and delivered a last line soaked in frost. This isn't over. Logan replied that endings belong to the facts now, not performances. She drifted into the hall with Marcus at her shoulder, a procession of power that had run out of parade. Outside, the night felt tighter, like decisions were walking on narrow ledges where one wrong step changes the map. Hart's phone buzzed with a docket ping that had no business arriving this fast. He scanned the entry and swore under his breath in words shaped like the law losing patience. A temporary injunction request had been filed to freeze Logan's clause pending review, timestamped to collide with the vote they had just survived. Someone had planned a legal ambush and missed the Hart by minutes. Cole read over his shoulder, jaw setting in a way that means lines just got thicker. Logan didn't blink. He asked Hart for a path. Hart said they needed the filings, the signature trail, the service attempts. Ward was already radioing for a copy from the courthouse feed. Lena checked the parking lot and spotted Karen's SUV idling near the dock, headlights on, passenger window cracked like a secret needed air. On the seat sat a fat folder, tabbed and ready, the kind of bait that winks at a man who hates traps. Evan tugged Logan's sleeve and whispered that Karen never left paper in cars. She carried files like currency. If the folder was visible, it meant panic or theater. Logan answered that panic and theater both burn when held up to flame. Hart advised caution. Cole nodded, and the group moved as one toward the dock, not hurrying, not lagging. The pace of people who understand that speed without sense is how you bury a victory. Neighbors followed at a distance, a living corridor for a procession none of them would forget. A child asked his mother if the bad guys go to meetings too. She said sometimes they run them. The kid asked who runs it now. She didn't point at Logan. She pointed at the word consequences floating above the scene like a banner nobody printed, but everyone could read. They reached the SUV. The engine ticked like a stress fracture. Hart used a glove from Ward's kit and lifted the folder with fingertips that treat paper like evidence and ammunition. Inside, schedules, emails, proxy tallies, a draft press release, and beneath them, a map with a drainage plan annotated in Karen's looping hand. Notes about timeline, pumps, and a developer dinner scheduled for the day after the water would have dropped below the line that kept the island safe. Basalt Partners circled like a promise made in a whisper. Then something else slid free, a smaller envelope sealed in red and labeled with Logan's parcel number. Hart frowned and passed it to Cole. Cole opened it and found a stack of signed complaints prepared in advance against Logan for harassment, nuisance, and interference with common welfare, each with a predated signature line for neighbors who had not yet been asked to sign. The plan wasn't to win fairly. It was to drown him in paper until he ran out of breath. How many times had this play worked on people who didn't have the strength or the time to fight back? Logan stood still, and for a heartbeat the flag in his crate seemed to weigh more across his shoulders. He asked Hart if this was enough to pivot the night from defense to offense. Hart said it was beyond enough. It was a map of intent. Cole radioed to secure evidence and asked Ward to document the chain. Lena started calling in the acting chair to return to the room. Evan closed his eyes like a man hearing a confession that frees and scars at once. A car door slammed across the lot. Karen stood in the headlights like a ghost that refuses to fade. Face set, shoulders squared, white sleeves bright enough to dare the darkness. Marcus hovered a step behind with the bravado of a man who isn't sure the ground loves him anymore. She didn't plead. She announced that any use of the folder was theft and that she would press charges. Hart replied that abandoned evidence at an open meeting site tells on itself. She said the injunction would freeze all of them by morning. Cole said the handcuffs would thaw it by noon if the judge saw what he was seeing. Karen took one step forward, eyes locked on Logan, and delivered the last thread she thought would hold. She said she had secured one more signature, one more ally, someone Logan would never expect. The lot held its breath as another engine cut, and a new figure stepped out of a sedan, adjusting a tie with fingers that looked too calm for a night like this. The face turned into the light, and every whisper in the crowd fell silent at once, because the ally was not a stranger. It was someone who had shaken Logan's hand earlier and smiled with both sides of his mouth. The man in the sedan adjusted his tie and stepped into the light like a promise with fine print. Adrian Vale, the polished stranger who shook Logan's hand at the meeting and called himself a concerned resident, now stood beside Karen with a folder that matched the docket ping on Hart's phone. He greeted Hart like an old sparring partner and announced that a temporary injunction had been filed to freeze Logan's clause and transfer emergency control of the docks to the Board for Community Safety. Earlier he had smiled wide. Now he smiled narrow, the way people do when they arrive with a trap and admire their own engineering. Hart asked who he represented. Vale said the community. Evan whispered the truth under his breath. Basalt Partners. Karen lifted her chin and told the crowd that order had returned, that the judge would sign at sunrise, that the docks would be chained by noon. She didn't look at Logan when she said it. She looked at the parents, the workers, the retirees, aiming her words where fear blooms fastest. Marcus nodded along like a chorus. Trent stared at his shoes and tried not to drown in the quiet. Hart opened the filing packet and read fast, lips tightening. He asked Vale to explain the service, the notice, the basis for emergency relief. Vale answered with velvet, a list of buzzwords about harm and risk and a newcomer's instability. Ward recorded every syllable. Lena scanned signatures and found a familiar shape that didn't belong where it sat. Evan blinked and swore softly. Several neighbor complaints had been pre-signed by names who were standing 10 feet away, mouths open, hands empty. The folder in Karen's car wasn't panic, it was an assembly line. Cole stepped forward and asked 3 neighbors to look at the copies. They did, and color left their faces in stages as they confirmed that what Vale had filed carried their names without consent. Karen said proxies cover certain filings. Hart said fraud covers handcuffs. Vale kept smiling like gravity was optional for people with good stationery. Logan didn't raise his voice. He asked Hart one question that cut to bone. Does the court like it when signatures travel without their owners? The night began to tip. The acting chair hurried back with a cluster of residents, breathless and indignant, carrying screenshots of texts from Karen's number, pushing talking points that did not survive contact with the ledger. Evan handed Hart a thumb drive he had been too afraid to use. Internal emails, time-stamped edits, a dinner itinerary between Karen, Vale, and a basalt executive set for tomorrow after the water drop. Lila tried to wrench the room back with a gavel that no longer chose her hand. The gavel stayed silent, the way Goodwood knows when not to lie. Hart's voice lost its courtroom courtesy and found something older. He stated for the record that the injunction filing showed material defects, falsified community complaints, undisclosed conflicts, and an emergency claim contradicted by the board's own redevelopment schedule. He looked at Vale and asked if he wished to withdraw before the court read it. Vale's smile strained, then returned. He said the judge would see past theatrics. Cole replied that the judge would see past a lot of things in the morning, including Karen's folder in an evidence bag. Karen turned to the crowd with a last performance and tried to make fear louder than proof. She said chaos would rule if one man controlled access. Logan answered without heat that abuse already had, and that families had paid for it with dues and silence. He told the room he would publish a simple dock policy by sunrise. Permits honored, emergency access protected, no chains without a court order. Parents stopped glancing at the exits. People stopped holding their breath. Even Trent's shoulders felt like he had been carrying someone else's armor. Vale pivoted to the deputies, arguing that the folder had been taken unlawfully and should be returned. Hart recited the doctrine that keeps evidence from vanishing when truth is inconvenient. Cole nodded to Ward, who sealed the bag and logged the chain. Lena asked Karen if she wanted to explain the pre-signed complaints before she saw them again under oath. Karen stared at the pavement and built a silence she couldn't stand on. Logan walked 2 steps forward, not to threaten, to close the gap between courage and fear. He said he knew what it felt like to lose a brother to a flag and rebuild a life with 2 hands and a promise. He said he bought this island to keep that promise alive, not to watch a board sell it by inches to people who never loved it. He said he would stand the line today, tomorrow, and the day after the vote, whether 5 people cheered or none did, because some ground doesn't belong to bullies, it belongs to whoever protects it when it's hardest. The crowd did not clap, they steadied. Evan spoke next, the man who had once looked at the floor and found his voice anyway. He told the neighbors he was done pretending, that he had watched small wrongs become big ones because nice people don't like fights. He said he would help audit every ledger, open every meeting, and if he found one more theft dressed as policy, he would carry it into daylight himself. He didn't look at Karen when he said it. He looked at the kid who asked earlier who runs meetings when bad guys show up and gave him an answer to take home. Karen's control frayed at the edges. She lunged for the bag. Marcus grabbed an elbow. The crowd flinched, and Cole moved with the quiet speed of a man who left his patients at the door for a reason. He took Karen's wrists with a firm, measured grip and told her she was detained pending investigation of filing false documents and attempted tampering. The earrings didn't sway, the room did. Marcus snarled, and took a half step that died when Ward's hand lifted slightly. Trent stayed put and whispered I'm sorry to no one in particular. Vale made one last play, a cool threat about injunctions and countersuits and the price of defiance. Hart answered with a courtroom date and a phrase that sounds almost like mercy when delivered cleanly. See you under oath. Vale's smile finally left. He stepped back toward his sedan without turning his back on the bag that ate his night. The cuffs clicked. Karen looked at Logan over her shoulder and said the lake would hate him for this. Logan said lakes don't hate. People do, and they can choose to stop. She rode away with lights splashing the road like a story trying to rewrite itself in real time. The neighbors didn't cheer. They stood with the kind of quiet that means something has ended and something else is allowed to begin. The acting chair asked Logan what tomorrow looked like. Logan rested the ranch stick against his shoulder and said tomorrow looks like permits processed fairly, kids fishing where they learn to love Saturdays, and a board that answers questions without flinching. He turned to Evan and told him to assemble a public audit team before breakfast. Evan nodded like a man who finally knew where he was going and why. Cole approached Logan with eyes that say respect without ceremony. He said the report would be long but clean. He said the law isn't perfect, but nights like this reminded how to stand up straight. Hart clasped Logan's forearm the way men do when they've spilled sweat together on different fields and told him the clause would be safe once the court saw what Basalt thought was clever. Logan thanked neither of them with words. He picked up the crate, lifted the folded flag with steadier hands than any hour before, and tucked it into the new home it deserved. Neighbors began to drift back to their cars with voices low and faces lighter. A mother paused and told Logan she could bring coffee for volunteers in the morning. A contractor offered a crew to fix what should have been fixed months ago. The teen who filmed the whole thing walked up, unsure, and asked if truth always takes this long. Logan answered that sometimes truth is slow, but it runs all night and doesn't get tired. He walked to the bridge and planted the ranch stick at the threshold not as a threat, as a vow made visible. The line wasn't for keeping people out. It was for keeping corruption from crossing in. Evan stood beside him, ledger under his arm, a reluctant ally turned necessary friend. Hart and Cole faded into the work that comes after the headlines inside small towns that never expected to be brave on a weekday. Logan looked across the water and promised the brother who couldn't be here that he would hold this ground without bitterness and without shortcuts. He promised the neighbors that he wouldn't become what he had just defeated. He promised himself that peace, once earned honestly, would be defended without apology. The lake answered the way honest things answer, by staying. And somewhere in the quiet between sirens and sleep, a community that had been managed by fear began to manage itself with courage.